To be exploring the connection between mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and really dig into this idea of equanimity, how it relates to well-being, and maybe most importantly, how it helps with stress.
Absolutely. And the sources you sent cover a lot of ground. We've got academic articles looking at how mindfulness and CBT fit together,
Right.
plus stuff on defining and even trying to measure equanimity, and a really practical piece on managing everyday stress, which, let's be honest, affects most of us.
It really does. You hear mindfulness everywhere now, don't you? Medicine, psychology, schools.
It's definitely become a buzzword.
But what's the actual relationship with something established like CBT? That's what we want to unpack. Okay, so where do we start? One source takes us way back.
Yeah, 5th century GC India, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha.
The Buddha, right. And his search started after seeing those foresights.
Exactly. Sickness, old age, death, and then someone seeking a spiritual path. It apparently sparked this quest to understand suffering and ultimately how to end it.
And the core idea he landed on was?
Fundamentally, that suffering isn't inevitable, but it arises from clinging, from trying to hold on to things, experiences, thoughts, emotions, even our idea of self that are, by nature, impermanent. They change.
Okay, clinging to things that can't last. That makes sense.
And the Buddhist psychological model, the BPM, kind of builds on that. It suggests distress comes from this constant craving for pleasant feeling to stick around, or conversely, this aversion, this pushing away of unpleasant feeling.
Because nothing stays the same.
Precisely. So we have these feeling tones, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, attached to everything we experience.
And the neutral ones just sort of drift past.
Pretty much. But the pleasant and unpleasant ones hook us. We want more pleasant, less unpleasant.
And that wanting and not wanting, that's the problem.
It leads to what the BPM calls mental proliferation. All that extra thinking, the commentary, the stories we build around the feeling, it just ramps up the distress.
Like taking a simple feeling and making it into a whole drama.
You got it. Think about depression, which one source uses as an example. We all feel down sometimes, right? That's natural.
Sure.
But the BPM suggests someone prone to depression might really fight against that feeling. Try to suppress it, avoid it.
Which just makes it worse.
It can fuel thoughts like, I shouldn't feel this way, or this is awful, I can't stand it. And then maybe a small thing like plans getting canceled because of rain gets blown way out of proportion.
Reinforcing negative ideas about themselves, maybe.
Exactly. It becomes a cycle.
Yeah.
The initial negative feeling, the resistance to it, then the mental spiral, and boom, intensified distress, maybe even a depressive episode.
Okay, so where does mindfulness fit into breaking that cycle?
Well, mindfulness is usually defined as, paying attention to right now, the present moment, with openness, curiosity, acceptance.
Without judgment.
Without judgment, crucially. In the BPM framework, it's seen as the antidote. It helps loosen the tight grip between the initial feeling tone, that subsequent mental churning, and the resulting suffering.
So it's not the sadness itself that's the core issue, but our reaction to the sadness, our fight against it.
It's a really key insight, yeah. That shift in perspective is huge. Mindfulness helps cultivate what's called decentering.
Decentering, okay.
It's that ability to kind of step back, observe your thoughts and feelings as just mental events, rather than getting totally swept away by them.
Like watching clouds pass in the sky?
Not the common analogy, yeah.
Yeah.
Or watching a movie instead of being the main character caught up in the drama. And it also fosters non-attachment, letting go of needing things to be a certain way.
So you see things more clearly, maybe, less tangled up in them.
Exactly. It changes your relationship to your inner world and actually the outer world, too.
Now, you mentioned decentering. One source links this to the cognitive model of depression, Beck and Hayes' work. Something about a self-referential information processing system.
Right. That model talks about schemas, dysfunctional attitudes, and automatic thoughts.
Can you quickly break those down? Schemas and attitudes.
Sure. Schemas are like these deep underlying beliefs about yourself and the world, often formed early on, like, I'm not good enough. Could be a schema.
Okay.
Dysfunctional attitudes are sort of related rules or assumptions that stem from those schemas. Like, if I don't succeed at everything, I'm a total failure. They make you vulnerable.
Got it. So those schemas and attitudes fuel negative automatic thoughts that just pop up.
Exactly. And what's interesting is the overlap here. Both the BPM and this cognitive model seem to agree that thoughts often just arise. We don't always choose them.
And reacting automatically, especially fighting them, can be unhelpful.
Precisely. And that's where mindfulness fits so well within the broader CBT world. It doesn't necessarily argue with the content of the thought.
Like classic CBT might.
Right. Instead, mindfulness changes your relationship to the thought. It reduces the power you give it by fostering acceptance and just open awareness, letting it be there without reacting.
Okay, so both agree the relationship to thoughts is key, but they approach it differently.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Classic CBT often involves actively challenging the logic of negative thoughts. Is this thought really true? What's the evidence? That kind of thing.
Cognitive restructuring.
Exactly. Mindfulness is more about noticing the thought, acknowledging it, and then letting it go without getting tangled in it. Breaking the reactivity cycle.
Are there deeper differences, too, philosophically?
Definitely. Mindfulness, even adapted for the West, often retains links to its Buddhist roots, which include exploring the nature of the self, seeing it as less fixed, less solid. CBT generally operates within a more standard Western psychological framework. The focus is usually on symptom reduction, improving function, and the self is typically seen as more stable, an agent making choices.
That makes sense. Different underlying views of reality, almost.
Kind of. And the source also mentions the ethical dimension in Buddhism, right? Mindfulness, which includes compassion, pro-social behavior. That's not usually a primary target in standard CBT protocols.
Interesting. And the training is different, too, for therapists.
Yeah, that's another point raised. Mindfulness-based approaches often really emphasize the therapist having their own regular mindfulness practice.
Walking the walk.
Exactly. Embodying the principles. That's not typically a formal requirement for CBT training in the same way.
Okay, so this leads us to specific therapies that combine these ideas, like MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy.
Right. MBCT was developed specifically for depression relapse prevention.
How does it work?
It helps people become more aware of the links between their mood shifts and those recurring negative thought patterns, the ones that can trigger a relapse.
So recognizing the warning signs earlier.
Yes, and crucially, developing that decentering skill. Learning to see those thoughts and feelings as transient mental events, not absolute truths about themselves or the world.
So instead of automatically believing I'm worthless, you notice, there's the thought I'm worthless again.
Precisely. You create distance. It emphasizes acceptance and non-reactive observation, which contrasts a bit with classic CBT's focus on actively restructuring or challenging the thoughts.
Okay. And then there's MCBT, Mindfulness Integrated Cognitive Behavioral Therapy.
Yeah, MCBT. Described as a sort of second-generation approach, it explicitly aims to weave mindfulness principles throughout standard CBT techniques while still acknowledging those Buddhist roots.
And it's transdiagnostic, meaning it could help with various issues, not just depression.
That's the idea, yeah. It's designed to be broadly applicable. The source mentions stages as follows.
Right, starting with personal mindfulness practice, intrapersonal regulation.
Then using mindfulness alongside exposure techniques for anxiety, which is behavioral regulation. Then applying it to relationships, interpersonal regulation.
And finally,
transpersonal regulation, focusing on empathy, compassion, sort of broadening the scope.
What are the key things driving MCBT?
Two main things highlighted are metacognitive awareness, knowing your own thoughts, and interoceptive awareness, sensing your internal body sensations. And crucially, this concept we keep mentioning, equanimity.
Equanimity again. How does ICBT view it?
As developing a neutral, balanced stance towards all experiences, pleasant or unpleasant, internal or external. It's less about the active vigilance of classic CBT, watching out for negative thoughts to challenge, and more about cultivating this stable, even-minded way of relating to whatever arises.
So less fighting, more allowing with balance, especially with those body sensations that often trigger emotions.
Exactly. And the research mentioned suggests it can be helpful for both depression and anxiety, possibly because it fosters this greater equanimity.
It really sounds like there's potential for mindfulness to enhance lots of aspects of CBT, like body awareness for exposure therapy or even just tracking behaviors.
Definitely seems like a synergistic relationship is emerging.
Okay, so we've seen mindfulness integrating with CBT, and this idea of equanimity keeps popping up as really important, especially in FEBT.
Absolutely. Which leads us perfectly into our next source, focusing squarely on equanimity itself.
So let's define it more clearly. If mindfulness is paying attention.
To the present moment, yeah. Equanimity adds this quality of even-mindedness.
Yeah.
It's an unbiased perspective, a kind of balance that comes from non-attachment, not clinging, and non-resistance, not pushing away.
The source had a driving example, right?
Yeah, it was quite helpful. Mindfulness is being aware You're driving hands on the wheel, the road, the sounds.
Noticing.
Just noticing.
Mm.
Equanimity is what allows you to stay calm and composed when someone cuts you off unexpectedly.
So it's about the response or lack of overreaction to the event.
Exactly. It's that capacity to observe what's happening, even if it's unpleasant, without getting emotionally hijacked by it. Maintaining your internal balance.
But it's not indifference. That seems like a key distinction.
Hugely important. It's not apathy. It's not caring. The source used a metaphor of a parent. A parent cares deeply for all their children, but might respond very differently to each child's needs depending on the situation. The underlying care is constant, but the outward response is tailored and skillful. Equanimity is like that, attentive, caring, but without getting entangled in excessive emotional reactivity.
Because the real suffering comes not just from feeling sad, but from desperately wanting not to feel sad, or wanting happiness to last forever.
That's the core idea from the Buddhist perspective, yes. The suffering arises from our reaction to the experience, the craving, the aversion. Equanimity allows for a more skillful, balanced response, less fuel on the fire.
So you can experience happiness without desperately clinging, or sadness without fighting it.
That's the goal. Mindfulness is the awareness, happiness is here, sadness is here. Equanimity is the quality that allows you to be okay with either state arising and passing without the frantic push and pull.
It builds on mindfulness.
Definitely. Mindfulness is the foundation. Equanimity is a quality that develops through that sustained, present moment awareness, adding that layer of balance.
So, practically speaking, how do people cultivate this? The source mentioned Buddhist techniques.
Yes, several approaches. Some involve simply noticing things, sights, sounds, sensations, without that immediate judgment of like or dislike, just observing.
Training the mind not to label everything instantly?
Kind of, yeah. Then there are concentration practices, samatha, aiming for stillness, which naturally fosters equanimity, and insight practices, vipassana, which involve investigating the nature of experience, seeing its impermanence, its conditioned arising, which also leads to less reactivity.
Sounds quite involved. Are there other ways?
Yeah, the source also mentions more accessible analytical reflections, like consciously thinking about how all beings want happiness and want to avoid suffering, just like you do. Cultivating that sense of shared experience can foster impartiality and compassion.
It's interesting how this ancient idea resonates in modern Western psychology, too.
It really does. Even if early psychoanalysis didn't use the word equanimity, that ideal of the therapist maintaining a kind of even, non-judgmental presence.
The evenly suspended attention.
Exactly. And helping the patient learn to observe their own feelings without being overwhelmed. There's a clear parallel there.
And the newer third wave, CBTs, ACT, DBT, MBCT, they seem to explicitly aim for the shift in relationship to inner experience.
Absolutely. Concepts like non-judging awareness, acceptance, decentering, letting go of attachment to outcomes, these are all facets of or pathways towards equanimity. It's about changing how we relate to our thoughts and feelings.
Developing that observing self you mentioned, that meta-awareness.
Precisely. That ability to step back from the internal narrative, see thoughts as just thoughts, feelings as just feelings. It reduces that sticky rumination and generally improves well-being. Equanimity seems fundamental to that shift.
So it's like an advanced emotion regulation strategy.
Yes, you could definitely see it that way. It changes the intensity and quality of our emotional responses, but it's different from effortful strategies like suppressing emotions or distracting yourself. It involves non-reactivity. It comes from recognizing that experiences arise and pass away. It's less about control, more about allowing with wisdom. It can even lead to cognitive flexibility, not being stuck in habitual reactions.
And that idea about faster recovery time, getting back to baseline quicker after stress.
Yeah, that's another angle. Strong emotions are useful signals.
Yeah.
But being constantly triggered keeps us in that stress state. Equanimity might mean the emotional wave still comes, but it passes more quickly. We return to calm sooner.
Which brings us to the challenge. How on earth do you measure something like this?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. Self-report scales are the most common tool, but they have obvious issues.
Like people confusing it with being numb or apathetic.
Exactly. Or just interpreting the questions differently. What does non-reactive really mean to different people? Plus, biases in self-reporting.
Are there any specific scales mentioned?
A few. Some scales look at resilience, others at non-attachment, others focus specifically on decentering, like the experiences questionnaire. But none perfectly capture the whole concept, it seems. There isn't full agreement yet on the best way to measure it via self-report.
So questionnaires are tricky. What about looking at the body's response? Physiological measures.
Now that's getting interesting. The source mentions heart rate variability, HRV, specifically RSA, respiratory sinus arrhythmia. Higher RSA seems linked to better emotional regulation, acting like a buffer.
Okay.
Also, skin conductance, how much you sweat, basically, which indicates arousal, and stress hormones like cortisol.
So the idea would be someone with more equanimity shows less of a spike in cortisol during stress, maybe, and comes back to normal fast.
That's the hypothesis, yes. Lower reactivity, faster recovery, reflected in physiology.
And brain imaging? What's neuroscience telling us?
Some really cool findings there. Studies looking at pain perception, for instance. Experienced meditators might report pain as less unpleasant, even if the sensory intensity is rated the same as non-meditators.
Interesting. How?
Brain scans suggest it might be linked to less activity in cognitive control areas, and maybe more activity in sensory processing areas. Almost like they're feeling it more purely, but with less mental resistance or story around it.
Less fighting it in the mind?
Seems like it. Other studies show experienced meditators have less intense brain responses to emotional pictures, but without showing increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area usually associated with effortful emotion control.
So it's not that they're actively suppressing the emotion.
It suggests the regulation is happening differently, perhaps more automatically, maybe at an earlier stage of processing. It hints that long-term practice might fundamentally change how the brain handles emotions.
Wow. Are these effects lasting?
Some longitudinal studies suggest yes. Novice meditators showing decreased amygdala activation, that's a key emotion center, even when they're not meditating, after undergoing training like MBSR.
So the training has effects beyond the meditation cushion.
It appears so. And faster amygdala recovery, after being presented with negative self-beliefs, has also been observed after mindfulness training, a potential neural marker of increasing equanimity.
And faster disengagement from bad stuff.
Yeah, some studies show meditators' attention gets unstuck from unpleasant images or sounds more quickly. And lower activity in the default mode network.
That's the mind-wandering network. Self-talk.
Often associated with that, yeah. Lower activity there in experienced meditators is sometimes linked to reports of less effort, more contentment. Again, aligning with this idea of equanimity.
This all ties back really nicely to stress, which is where we started, and what our third source mentions. Most of us feel stressed.
It's almost a default state sometimes, isn't it?
And stress is just the body reacting to change, needing to adjust. But the problem is staying stuck in that high alert mode.
Exactly. It's meant to be temporary. But chronic stress happens when we don't come back down.
So it feels like understanding mindfulness, and especially this quality of equanimity, gives us a powerful framework. It lays the groundwork for managing that stress response differently, maybe helping us stay more present.
I think that's exactly right. By understanding how our thoughts, feelings, and reactions are linked, and by cultivating this more balanced, even-minded awareness, this equanimity, we potentially change our whole relationship with stressful events.
We develop more skillful ways to navigate them.
Yeah, fostering that inner calm, even when things outside are turbulent.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together. We've looked at how mindfulness and CBT connect, sometimes overlapping, sometimes differing, but both tackling how our thoughts influence our suffering.
Right, and how integrating mindfulness can shift the focus from just changing thoughts to changing our relationship to them.
And we really dove into equanimity, that balanced, even-minded quality. Not indifference, but a stable presence that allows for better emotional regulation and resilience.
A quality rooted in ancient wisdom, but increasingly being explored and validated, you could say, by modern science, psychology and neuroscience.
Finding physiological and neural correlates for these states of mind. It's fascinating stuff.
It really is.
So the final thought we want to leave you with is this. Consider your own life. How might intentionally cultivating a bit more of this even-mindedness towards the good stuff and the difficult stuff, how might that shift your experience of stress?
How might it change your sense of presence day to day? It doesn't have to be a huge change, maybe just what's one small step you could take, even just experimenting, to explore that quality of balance in your own life, something to reflect on.